So our three speakers are Christine Callahoo, and you may have noticed she is also a board member of SCBC. And Christine is a registered professional planner with 25 years of experience in a diverse range of planning areas, including asset management, planning with a specific focus on natural assets, regional land use and community planning, community safety planning, and community-focused climate mitigation and adaptation planning. She has had the opportunity to work with all levels of government, with communities throughout Western and Northern Canada, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and the private sector. Our second speaker this morning will be Tamsin Lyle. She is the principal and founding engineer of Ebwater Consulting and a well-known thought leader on flood management in Canada. She has been advocating for ecosystem-based flood risk reduction for more than 20 years. And then finally on our panel, we'll have James Casey. On behalf of Birds Canada, James works at building support for conservation actions within the Fraser Estuary Important Bird and Biodiversity Area. He earned a master's degree in international environmental policy with a focus on treaties related to transboundary watershed management. Previously, James worked with WWF Canada on topics ranging from eelgrass and marine planning to hydropower and the Water Sustainability Act. So what we will be doing is having the three panelists present, and don't be shy by typing any questions you might have for any of the panelists into the chat, and we'll let the three panelists speak, and then we'll have time for question and answers after everybody has spoken. So with this, I'll stop sharing my screen, and Christine, you can queue up yours.
Share mine. Awesome. Can you see?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, ready, set, go. So I am going to specifically talk about natural assets and ecosystem services, but climate change comes into it because it's all part and parcel to community resilience and ecosystem resilience. So with that, use the mouse. Okay, gotcha. All right. Sorry, folks, I just got to move the mouse here. So the challenge. Changing climate is by far the biggest existential challenge that the human race has had to face. And we need to look at all potential options in our collective efforts to address the challenge, including bravely examining and boldly revising the human concept of value and how we protect, manage these resources. Oh, this thing's gonna drive me nuts. Natural assets are not generally recognized as a valued asset, as in monetary. They are largely undervalued and therefore negatively impacted by the very species that relies upon the ecoservices provided. I'm going to slow it down a little bit because I'm tripping over myself. The changing climate has introduced significant challenges to humans, as I mentioned, requiring that we as humans step back, rethink business as usual, and collectively reconfigure in order to enable our continued existence. With natural asset recognition and strategic incorporation contributing to this goal of continued existence. You know, why not, right? I kind of like living. So when I talk about resilience, and you could apply this to communities, resilience is the sustained ability of an ecosystem to utilize available resources to respond to, withstand, and recover from, build back better, adverse situations while continuing to maintain ecological integrity. So you could say communities, similar to this, is while maintaining essential community services. Same idea, right? Resilience is resilience is resilience. So what is an asset? I need to get into this because a lot of people aren't recognizing assets, just in general, infrastructure. Well, assets are everything human, right? There's emergency management services, there are linear assets, there are potable water, our green space. Oh, I'm going to throw that one right in there, green spaces. We've also got our community services, you know, recreation, schools, right? Gathering spaces, as well as the services that families rely upon, right? Assets provide services that contribute to our quality of life. Natural assets Oh, there we go. I got it to sit down. There we go. All right, all right. Natural assets refer to the stock of natural resources or ecosystems that is relied upon, managed, or could be managed by a municipality, regional district, or other form of government for the sustainable provision of one or more municipal services. And again, folks, you're going to get our panel presentations. We'll be putting them up, so you can take a look at this later. So this is the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. I love the Federation of Canadian Municipality, FCM. As a pressure group, they do great work in asset management. I don't like this image that much, but what it does do is it illustrates infrastructure embedded. It's all things human. I just don't like how they have the arena, some higher density development outside of town, which contributes to urban sprawl. And the fact that this 3-lane hardtop is the primary focus of this image, which of course we need to step away from business as usual. But it's a lovely image in that it illustrates our assets. It's all things human. So basically, meeting the social and recreational needs of communities, public health and safety, sustainable communities, small s, enabling economic development, it is all things. So I think I've hammered it home. Assets are all things human. All right. So a lot of folks, because there is just a whole gamut of information out there these days, green infrastructure, natural asset, ecosystem services. Well, MNAI, Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, so mnai.ca, take a look, BC-based, they have this illustration that I use because it really helps people defray when we talk about green infrastructure. So we have engineered assets, right? So that's the urban sexy, the Canada Place, the green rooftop. Then we have enhanced assets. Then we have natural assets. So it really delineates within green infrastructure. And where I see Green Shores coming in, the Green Shores program, Stewardship Center for BC's GEM, is natural assets and enhanced assets, because it's often restored ecosystems that then are able to provide. So this is just a snapshot that I thought perhaps you guys would find helpful. And of course, this is one of my faves, because and I'll use this in class with students because it's really warm and fuzzy. Humans love this stuff, but it also shares all the different services that this one little spot on the planet, if kept healthy, can provide, right? So natural assets provide value, support community resilience, and require effective, efficient management in line with our assets. Why are we not managing our assets? I mean, we're poor at general asset management, never mind hauling in our natural assets. Geez, we got work to do. There's growing evidence that natural assets provide, or could be restored to provide, services just like engineered assets, often at a lower cost. So key benefits, this is, and again, these are snapshots, right? Because we're just doing a flyover. So take a look at these afterwards. But what this shows is how a natural asset, so a green space, can provide all these different services. Whereas when we talk about stormwater storage, it's usually gray infrastructure and it serves one purpose. And it's super expensive. We have to maintain it and we have to replace it eventually. Why not take a look at our natural assets first? See what they provide, similar to the town of Gibson's, and then augment and reduce your costs. But the challenge, of course, is people are going, yeah, but how do we incorporate that into our business as usual, right? Finance, accounting, asset management, planning, engineering, etc. So, of course, then we run up against how can you possibly put a monetary value on our inherent values, our ecosystem services, and our natural assets? We have to, folks. We need to get past that. So how do you place a monetary value on an inherent value? Well, or do you? If not a monetary value that is able to span most knowledge levels and therefore communicate value in most languages, i.e. money, how do we value natural assets? And how are these values impacted by the changing climate? Oof, these are questions we must ask. So comparative. Compare the service provided by the natural asset with the cost of providing that service through an engineered structure. So comparative costing. So Town of Gibson's, a number of other places, that's how it all starts, is if we can restore a wetland in order to provide that service, what would we normally have to pay in order to build that service? Well, then that's what that natural asset is worth at this point in time, because we're at the initial stages of valuation. And of course, this just breaks it down. And again, folks, you will have this PowerPoint, so go ahead and take a peek at it. But I love this breakdown because it really clarifies, certainly for me, when I'm getting organized in my thinking about assets, natural assets, ecosystem services, built, natural, etc. So is natural capital really valuable in financial terms? As you'll note in this slide, absolutely. Trees in California, $1 billion in ecosystem services, atmospheric regulation and flood prevention, Canadian boreal forests. Significant, they provide 2.5 greater value than the actual resource extraction. That doesn't seem like good investment on from my perspective as a Canadian taxpayer. But of course, it relies on the ecologically intact boreal forests. So alert, alert, alert. Because it's not intact, folks. We're logging like nobody's business. So this is another one. This is just another about valuation. So this is the town of Gibson's that I mentioned, 3.5 million to 4 million of stormwater storage services annually. You can put that in the books, right? And all they did was they restored the ecological integrity of an area that already existed, right? And now it provides a natural asset and ecosystem service to the community. And trails, everyone loves to be in that space, et cetera, et cetera. And then these other examples here are there for you for reference. And I've cited everything, folks. So if you would like to take a look at these and carry on with that research, please do and please share. So highlights, natural assets can reduce service delivery costs. Natural assets have a perpetual lifespan, unlike our built assets, if we maintain the ecological integrity of that asset. Natural assets are carbon neutral or carbon positive, i.e. carbon sequestration initiatives. And then natural assets support climate change adaptation, like no other built asset can. So natural assets and ecosystem services are invaluable. So let's strategically value as if our survival depended upon them. Thank you. Over to you, Tamsin.
Perfect. Thanks.
Oh, yeah. And now, yeah.
So stop screen, share screening. Perfect. Thank you very much, Christine.
Stop share. Okay, there you go.
And Tamsin can queue up there.
Nice. Oh, mute.
Tamsin, you're unmuted. Can you unmute yourself or?
I can, yes, sir.
There you go.
I lost the Zoom. Apologies. And I'm going to try and speak really loudly. I have a construction site outside my window, which just started. But I think that speaks to the problem. We have construction all around us. And Christine set us up really well there, describing what all of these natural assets are. And what I'm going to do today is reflect on my 20+ years of being an engineer in this space and basically banging my head against the wall to create opportunities for these ecological features in our natural environment, either to keep them where they are or to create new ones. And I'm going to do that by going through a little adventure with you in time, looking at where we are today, how we got there, and why we are so entrenched in the pathways that we are now. So I am going to have the same exact problem as Christine. I'm trying to figure out, oh, there we go. All right. So if we think about something like flood, historically, millennia ago, and in fact, you will hear this in many of the local First Nations stories, the way we managed this hazard was that we just adapted to the natural rhythms of the system. And so whether that's the ebb and the flow of the tide or the annual freshet on river systems, we would just move away when it mattered and come back to enjoy all of the bounty that these systems bring. But of course, over time, we had a desire to use the floodplain in a different way. We started to settle on those floodplains, and we started to drain them so that we could have agriculture. And as a result, we really sort of transformed how we lived with water to the point where we are today. We sort of set ourselves up now in a state where we have all of these systems in place on the floodplains. And so we've come to the point where we feel like we need to defend ourselves from that water. Currently, we have about more than 1,000 kilometers of dikes in the province, 360 odd in the lower mainland, that create this safe paradox for us. We feel like these things protect us from the water, and so we develop more. If you build it, they will come. But this, of course, has a whole whack of problems that Christine started to describe. And so one of the things I just wanted to let you know here is, you know, we've got ourselves in this mess locally in terms of these dikes. And one of the reasons is we don't frame flood in a very good way. And so one way to move away from this is to start thinking about how we manage, it's very similar to what Christine was saying, how we manage for being wet in a different way. And instead of just thinking about stopping the water, using these hard infrastructures, whether that's a dike or a seawall or any of these other things you see along the shorelines, we got to think about what matters more. And that's really that we don't want to be hurt or damaged. We don't want those assets to be non-recoverable. So we got to start thinking about this in a different way. And so I use the word risk in a very specific way. And if you work with anyone who works in disaster risk reduction or flood risk reduction, we all use risk in a very specific way, which is not necessarily how you as a layperson or someone who uses it colloquially will use it. And that is, risk is a function of all of these layers of things. The hazard, in this case, water, the bad thing, the elements or the assets in the way of that water. Christine already did a good job of explaining what those are, as well as their susceptibility or vulnerability to being damaged. Some things can be wet temporarily. Some things cannot, you know, a hospital versus a playing field. These are different mechanisms. We need to think about all of these three things together if we think about risk. If you think about the area inside that triangle as being the risk, take away any one of these elements and the triangle collapses and there is no more risk. And that's what we really care about. On the flip side, increase any one of those vertices and we have more risk, which is not where we want to be. Unfortunately, of course, it is where we are. And to explain this, I'm going to take you on an adventure of the last 50 odd years for which I actually have data to show you what's happened in British Columbia. Using some new data sets, sort of global data sets that look at both the flood hazard layer. So this is the blue on this map shows you where we have flood hazard in British Columbia from rivers, not from the coast. Apologies, shore people, but I don't have the data set for that. And layered on top of that, the built form, the people, the structures that we have on the floodplains. And these have been developed using satellite imagery and all sorts of cool light methods to, you know, the brighter the light, the more people and more things that are there. And there's a global data set for this. But just zooming into BC, in 1975, we had about 700,000 people living on our floodplains, primarily in the Lower Mainland, but also in the Okanagan. As we flip through time here, you will see that we're just going to add and add and add people to our floodplains. We are living in the safe development paradox. We put all of this hard infrastructure in place and we think, hey, we're good. Let's put a whole bunch of valuable things behind that hard infrastructure. We now have 1.2 million people living in the riverine floodplains of British Columbia. That's a lot of people who are at risk should that very brittle infrastructure fail. We've added 500,000 people, mostly again in the Lower Mainland behind those 300 kilometers of dike. There are places where we've taken people out of the floodplain, Prince George, Prince Rupert. But overall, the message is kind of terrifying in terms of where we put ourselves in the last 50 years or so. So that's one arm of our risky triangle, that's our exposure. And then on top of that, of course, we have climate change. And climate is affecting everything we do. And in the case of flood hazard, it is increasing our flood hazard, both the frequency, the severity, the intensity of all of our events. And so we're going to have a scenario where we're going to have more hazards. So we're now increasing two elements of our triangle. We've just dramatically increased our risk based on the decisions we've made in the last 50 years. So what on earth can we do about this? Well, we can continue to evolve. There are things that we can do. And the first thing to do is really to embrace this risk model, to not focus on stopping the water with those hard pieces of infrastructure, but instead thinking about our need to reduce our damages and to be able to recover more quickly after an event. But of course, we have limited resources, so we need to be able to think carefully about where we spend our dollars, to make sure that we are applying our dollars to the things that matter most, hospitals, for example, people, as opposed to spending money to protect recreational infrastructure or things that are less important as a society. And finally, we need to recognize that climate is uncertain. And so we're going to have to face a future where we need to adapt iteratively to the problem. And those structural defenses that we have used historically are really brittle. They work until they fail, and then they fail dramatically. And what we need to work towards is having infrastructure, natural infrastructure in place that enables us to adapt to future climate change. One way to do this, to start getting ourselves out of the serial engineering cycle, is to really start chipping away at our triangle, starting with our vulnerability. This is something we need to accept, is that we need to make sure our buildings and our communities and our people are better protected when they get wet, because we will get wet. It's a gorgeous sunny day today in Vancouver, but we are all British Columbians and we all know what rain looks like. And I can guarantee that no one in this Zoom room will go outside in a rainstorm naked. And yet that's really what we have on our floodplains. We have naked assets that are sitting there waiting to be cold and miserable, when what we need to do is we need to dress them up in a raincoat, in their galoshes, so that when they get wet, you can take those things off, you can go home, have a cup of tea, and recover quickly. So we have the capacity to start meddling with our vulnerability, to start chipping away at our risk triangle. And if we do that, that enables us to start freeing ourselves from the serial engineering cycle and all of those structures, and we can start taking those away. And if we do that, we're much better off in the end, because the hazard itself and the powerful damages that are incurred from hazard are often a function of the infrastructure that's in the way of it in the first place. Super simply, if you think about water hammering a coast, all of you know this because this is your bread and butter. If you hammer the coast against a seawall that's a concrete seawall or all of that rock, it's going to land a lot more hard than if it takes a soft landing on a nice natural piece of infrastructure like a sponge. So these are like obvious things that we can do, but we need to start breaking our way out of the cycle to enable these things to happen. But we don't. And that is ultimately because we kind of suck at change. We are really entrenched in our pathways, especially as engineers. We are unwilling to get out of this because it's scary. This is change. I mean, it's change to go back to the place we were 500 years ago, but it's still change. And so we need to get out of this. And I think Christine already highlighted some of these concepts, but things like cost benefit practices rarely favor non-engineered structures because they just look at the capital dollars and cents and not that long-term operational maintenance cost that's really important, which for natural infrastructure tends to be lower. And quite honestly, I can say this as an engineer, and I know there's a couple of more on the site. Engineers often are leading these kind of large-scale projects. Not the small, great stuff that gets done by Smart Shores, for example, but these really big picture ideas are nearly always led by engineers. And engineers are exceptionally good at engineering, but we're not very good at all of those other things. We can add a token bit of green on top of our dike, but we can't imagine that dike not being there in the first place. And so I think another area that we really need to work on is our procurement to ensure that we have holistic and large groups of people working on procurement so that we have the right solutions that will enable us to be safe from flood in the future. And so, in summary, all of this risk that we've created for ourselves is ultimately human caused. And so I think with a bit of humility, we can get out of our entrenched pathways and this can be human solved. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Tamsin. That was fantastic. So if you could stop sharing and then James will cue you up, please. Thanks.
Excellent. I should be up and running.
There you go.
First off, a thank you to Jason Puttyfoot for the photo behind me. If people can see, that's a flock of western sandpipers from the Fraser River estuary. A really interesting tale of how flood infrastructure and freshwater and development intersect in terms of our biodiversity. So I'm going to speak a little bit to the bird's eye perspective of the topic today of biodiversity, infrastructure, and climate change. I'm not progressing, there we go. So for us at Birds Canada, green infrastructure really sits at a nexus of mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity loss. These are three big challenges that humanity's faced. So we already kind of touched on climate in climate change. So I'm going to highlight that we also are in a crisis of biodiversity loss globally. 68% loss in the average wildlife population around the globe. And when you pair that with addressing the projected levels of warming, so we're currently on a path of 2.7 to 3 degrees warming, unfortunately, and this challenge that society faces about adapting to that level of warming. For instance, Canada's disaster finance and assistance and arrangement projects are projected to reach 900 million a year. Really, there's a tension there between these three things, and our capacity to actually deliver on them requires that re-envisioning that Christine spoke to and Tamsin challenged us at the end there. These are human issues that we can meet if we become inventive. But for the birds, things have been not doing that great. Like I said, we have lost globally species, and in the avian world, we've also seen significant declines in birds such as shorebirds, grassland birds, and aerial insectivores. Unfortunately, since the 1970s, across North America, we've lost about 3 billion birds. There have been some good news stories, and waterfowl is definitely one of them, and I'm going to come back to that because it's a case where some wetland management has really helped out. Birds of prey have also done well, and in this case, it isn't necessarily habitat management, but a little bit more managing some pesticides and hunting activities that have helped. But overall, the story isn't really that great for birds, with a general loss in birds and abundance, and also, unfortunately, for us, a loss in a number of bird species. Shorebirds, grassland birds, and aerial insectivores are ones that we need to address in Canada if we're going to say that our infrastructure is green and addresses this biodiversity crisis. We need to make sure that those species are recovered. And from a wider perspective of biodiversity here at Birds Canada, we like to think of birds as the window on nature, in that the birds are what we can easily observe. They're how we easily interact. And so they're a great indicator of the ecosystem that supports these bird populations. So if we're seeing declines in bird populations, we're also seeing a decline in the health and function of the ecosystem they rely on. Climate impacts on birds is a big topic. One of my favorite resources right now from a more layperson perspective or easier reading is 389 Species on the Brink by Audubon. It's American focused, but it does a great job of capturing in a fairly consumable way a number of the threats facing birds and how they'll impact birds across their range. If you're looking for something a lot more detailed, the British Ornithological Union just put out a 2-day conference on how climate change and birds are interacting, and so you can access that at their website. One of the big pieces to think about when thinking about birds is this extreme weather issue, and the birds can function and migrate and adapt fairly well within a range, but when we start getting into extreme weather events, it has a huge impact on their reproductive success. And so things like extreme heat days or extreme snow days or rain days all have impacts on their ability to reproduce in the breeding grounds and feed along the migration. And so that western sandpiper that's behind me this year had some real troubles in the Arctic, as a few days of unanticipated snow interrupted their breeding opportunities. So yeah, so the issue of extreme events and the shift in variability is a big challenge, both for the adaptation world from a human perspective, but then also from the biodiversity's perspective, as like I said, the birds and the wildlife they represent function well enough within the general range of a given climate, but when they start getting exposed to major events, they're not well adapted to that kind of short duration, high intensity event that we're going to see more of as we put more energy into the system. And so when I've been thinking recently about the question of what does applied green infrastructure looks like, I've been thinking a lot about the importance of managing for disturbance. And so I put up in the title of this, Managing Disturbance to Enable Predictability. I think predictability is a really important outcome for us as managers seeking some desired good at the end of the day. So we're not necessarily going to be able to achieve stability if we're talking about a 3-degree world or a 2-degree world. But perhaps if we start putting resources into managing how the disturbance regime plays out on the landscape, we do gain a little bit of predictability, which is important for us from a social system perspective. And it's also important for the bird that they can manage their arrival and expect food availability or nesting habitat to be present. Then they can successfully reuse those habitats year after year and maintain populations. And so when we talk about managing disturbance, I think it's something we already kind of know how to do. Wetlands is one place where we manage the disturbance of flooding. Another where we've tried and probably haven't done as good a job as we would like is in forestry. Often in forestry, sustainable forestry, we're looking to reproduce those disturbance regimes of a fall down or a fire effect. And one other one that I'll touch on here in a minute is also rangeland management in the prairies. And so, like I said, wetlands is something where we invested millions, hundreds of millions across Canada in managing wetlands. And those wetlands, from a conservation perspective, were being managed for waterfowl and other wildlife values. More recently, we've started to also look at wetlands from the benefit they can provide both for flood mitigation and for climate mitigation. And so this is an example from the island of the Buttertubs Marsh in the Nanaimo area. And one of the projects that the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative has become involved in after it's been reclaimed from what was a historically farmers' fields to become wildlife habitat by the Nature Trust and Ducks Unlimited. And then now they're looking at it as the potential for for flood mitigation during peak flows. And so this is one example where they're actively managing the flooding or the level of water within this land base to provide multiple benefits to society of different types. Another one that we're looking at is beef as a grassland disturbance in the grasslands of the Great Plains. So this isn't in BC, this is beef in BC plays a slightly different role, but within the grasslands of the prairies, free-range beef at correct densities does replicate the disturbance that took place historically through bison. And so this grazing effect has an impact on the vegetation that occurs in these grasslands and supports, again, at managed densities, increased biodiversity and habitat for birds. And so one of the questions we've been asking ourselves as an organization is how to enable these kind of disturbances on private lands for public benefit. So this is one of the challenges, I think, as we talk about adaptation writ large across the country, is our private land and private market system need to be leveraged for public benefit if we're going to manage to adapt to the coming changes of climate. And so we put together for the grasslands area this incentives guide to help farmers access various sources of financing so that they can gain more benefits for their free-range beef, but also provide benefits such as carbon sequestration and biodiversity. And so one of the questions that we're challenged with, from my perspective, because I am engaged in something called the Important Bird and Biodiversity Area for the Fraser Delta, is how do we address the emerging threat of coastal flooding? And so this is a map from the Fraser Basin Council's flood management process, representing the level of threat of coastal flooding, and under 2100 scenario of 1 meter rise by 2100. And one of the solutions that folks such as that West Coast Environmental Law and the city of Surrey brought forward in our testing is the concept of a living dike. And so replicating that process, that environmental function of putting sedimentation onto the bay that has been interrupted by things such as jetties and dikes, which Tamsin spoke to raise that overall level of sediment as sea level slowly rise, that allows for that vegetation to continue to persist on the delta. And if that vegetation continues to persist, it provides habitat for species such as the western sandpiper behind me, or the least sandpipers on the picture here in that mudflat, as well as providing flood risk attenuation by addressing or reducing the intensity of that wave infrastructure that you saw when you thought that simplified picture of the brick and the sponge. These vegetations and sediment are providing a similar role. Question is, how do we pay for it? It's going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars for society to pay for this adaptation, and finding the resources to protect this area will be a major undertaking for us. I've talked a little bit about disturbance and functional diversity. When we're thinking about climate change, I also wanted to, and birds, I wanted to highlight that we also have issues of scale and connectivity that we need to deal with. And so I just wanted to highlight the work of the Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture and its partners that work at a flyway scale, and the work they do to identify and conserve habitat all along the flyway has been critical. And then lastly, at the global scale, to talk about an upcoming event tomorrow that Canada is putting on as part of its role at the Global Commission on Adaptation, looking at nature-based solutions. And so Canada has committed $7 million to nature-based solutions through this commission, and could be an interesting conversation at the global scale to talk about how Canada is contributing to this challenge. I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you so much, James. That's fantastic. Really great opportunity. I'll turn it over to Sierra to field some or to read the questions for our panelists.
Awesome. Thanks, folks. So the first question we have here in the chat, I do see that Christine, you provided an answer, but I'll open it up to the other panelists as well, in case they have anything to add. So that's from Douglas, and his question is, in many regions of BC, corporate industrial fiber mining, BAU forestry, has a massive impact on hydrology. Do you think changing forest practices and rates of cut should be a priority?
I can quickly answer that. Yeah, I mean, I didn't even, I mean, I was trying to be very brief in my presentation, but I think one of the other things that we need to consider is the scale of the problem, and it's really a watershed scale problem. So responding to and making better decisions about how we use our upstream watersheds will absolutely reduce the power and the force of that river coming downstream, let alone all of the biodiversity benefits I'm sure also exist, and I'll leave the others to talk about that. But from an engineering perspective, it makes all the sense in the world to be protecting our watersheds.
Anything else to add from the other panelists?
I'll jump in on that one. So absolutely, Doug, I think all of our industrial practices need to be revisited if we're going to address the scope of the challenge that's coming. Christine provided a very important reframing of resources to assets, natural assets, and I think that's critical to apply not just in the urban landscape, but all across our practices in our natural resources. And so thinking about the role of forest in the full envelope of assets that provides our society will be critical. But that will trigger a discussion about how to deal with the enclosure of forest for private or public benefit. And so that's going to be a difficult conversation that is coming.
Great, Thank you.
And I'm just going to quickly say, government is us. And so we need to either elect a leader, like 2 leaders, or get our butts in there, because otherwise this regime will not change. We all know it needs to change. We've talked about it for at least 20 years, as Tamsin has alluded to. Like, we've been at this, it's been a slog. But unless we actually elect governments that represent the values of the communities they serve versus, some kind of ideology, nothing's going to change. So at the local level, provincial level, national level, we all need to engage. Working democracy takes work. Let's, get over it, roll up our sleeves and get to work. I'll stop.
Thanks, Christine. That fits in nicely with our next question here. What can an individual do to encourage City Hall and Council to recognize and incorporate natural assets into our everyday asset management?
Get it in your inventory. Get it in the asset management plan, even if it's just simply, so we've done a couple of pilots in communities doing asset management, the conventional asset management planning, what we call it comprehensive asset management planning. Why? Because we bring in the assets, the natural assets, we list them. And then to do a conditions assessment, yeah, we're bumping about there. It's a bit of transition because it's new, it's not business as usual. So that is where the role of the ecosystem specialists come in, or the biologists, in terms of working alongside planners and engineers to do a conditions assessment. Get it in your asset management plan, because then every year it becomes the mandate of, as the departments are relevant. And also in terms of financing, making sure that, let's just be frank though, humans have so much work to do in just standard asset management, right? And then as part of that journey, we should just tuck it right in. It should be, and then of course, bring in the climate change lens. Asset management planning, in my mind, I don't even want to do community and land use planning anymore unless it's asset management planning in the community, because all of that should be in your asset management plan. All your assets, natural assets, conditions assessment, long-term financial planning, maintenance, and execution. Everything should be in your asset management plan. I'll stop.
Awesome.
I was going to add another mechanism, and I think it's to be sneaky, to be quite honest, because all of these concepts are things that have enormous number of co-benefits, and they're the things that the public cares about. So if you can advocate for having a walking path or whatever it is along the shoreline rather than that hard seawall, that's a really strong message that politicians like to hear, and that will enable these kind of things to happen.
Thank you.
Be sneaky.
Yeah, hi, I realized the time, so just to check in, Sierra, are there any other questions or?
I haven't seen any, no.
Okay, well, that's perfect time. Perfect. Oh, looks like Joan has way up time for one more.
Yeah, is that not so much a question, but just to share an experience about, 15 years ago when I was still with Fraser Basin Council. I was involved with the Prince George, the flood hazard reduction strategy, because you may recall we had a huge ice jam on the Fraser River, in the Chaco-Fraser River confluence there. And so we helped out with the public involvement part of it, but also got to work with some very skilled engineers and in the assessment, the consultants. And one of the things, and Tamsin alluded it to a bit, was removing people from the floodplain. That was one of the options that was offered, along with, do we build more dikes? Do we extend with the few that we have and everything? And there are actually some people, this was on the Chaco above where meets the Fraser, but had said, we're ready to sell out. We can't do this again, because there were some people were flood, had 4 feet of water in their homes, in their yards. And actually it was, the water came up through the gravelly soils. It wasn't up and over the banks. It's just because it's so gravelly down that end of the river that was, and with the ice jammed, it created so much pressure because the water couldn't move. It just came up through the ground. And so a number of people did agree, quite willingly said, we'll sell to the city. So slowly, it's over time, but it's in the policy of that document anyways. I don't know where it stands as far as the city's asset management, but there's one example where that was one of the solutions, and it had been implemented in part, and it's a long-term thing again, so that it is possible.
It's totally possible. And I think just really quickly, I mean, think of that triangle, you're collapsing an entire part of it, right? By removing the people and or avoiding putting them there in the first place. And it's something we're seeing more and more. So Grand Forks is a really good example that's currently underway. Fort McMurray is not a good example, but actually last week, Public Safety Canada made an announcement related to this. And so they've got a new task force that'll be starting in January called Strategic Relocation. So it's all about how you frame it, move, not retreat. But that's an initiative that's currently underway federally, so that where the government will start paying to remove people from the floodplain rather than paying for them to rebuild their homes, for them to get damaged again. And then there's obviously the huge co-benefit that we've restored we can restore the natural function of the floodplain and have all of those other wonderful ecological benefits. So it's happening slowly, lots of good things.
Yes. And so wonderful to have these sorts of conversations to bring in the different aspects. So thank you again to our three panelists, James, Tamsin, and Christine. I'm just going to share my screen with the, just to finish up so that people can see that we really can't do this, the work that we do at the Stewardship Center without our funders, including Environment and Climate Change Canada, Natural Resources Canada, the province of British Columbia, the Sitka Foundation and the Real Estate Foundation. And then you can see all the in-kind partners down there. We've got a lot of partners and super happy to have them on board. So I'll turn it over now to Joanne, I think, to just do our final thank yous and goodbyes. And I guess we need a motion to adjourn as well.
Certainly, DG, thank you. No, thank you to everybody for joining us today. It's been informative, interesting, and I'm seeing from the comments here, many people they just enjoyed it, and I think it is great. We're just doing such good work, and it's just so important that we continue to reach out, share, and stay connected. So please do go to the Stewardship Center webpage. You'll find the presentations from today and other great info as well. And encourage people to sign up. There's a link on there to sign up and become a member and receive regular updates from Stewardship Center for British Columbia. And it's important to stay in the loop and find out what's happening. So just want to thank all our speakers, our new members of the board, our members that are retiring from the board, and just everybody who's involved in this fantastic organization. And DG, any final comments?
Just very good. If we can just get somebody from the board to motion
Make
for
a motion
adjournment.
now. Somebody from the board make a motion to adjourn.
I will adjourn. Tracy.